It is said that amateurs talk tactics, professionals study logistics. So let's split the difference and amateurishly talk about logistics. Many years ago, a buddy of mine told me about his final year university project. The setup went as follows. Imagine you have a truck that can carry enough cans of fuel in the back to go 1,000 miles. What's the least amount of fuel it would take to go 2,000 miles? Well, it seems impossible, obviously, but if you could drop off the fuel cans along the route, then you could drive out part of the way, set up a stockpile, use that to drive out further, and so on. I thought it was an interesting problem, but I never found out how he solved it and forgot all about it. More recently, I've been enjoying a collection of Unmitigated Pedantry, by which I mean a history blog by Dr. Brett Devereaux. I highly recommend the blog as very readable, giving me lots of aha moments and provoking equal parts admiration and jealousy that Dr. Devereaux is maintaining an academic career, writing a book, putting out thousands of words on his blog, and still seems find time to play a huge range of video games. In the post about the logistics of pre-modern armies, he talks about how difficult it was historically to keep a moving army fed. A soldier can only carry a limited supply of food besides shields, spears, chainmail, and so on. Even a soldier dedicated to only carrying food would have to eat. Just like a truck loaded with fuel cans, a horse pulling a cart also has a limited range because it too has to eat the very cargo it is carrying just to keep moving. Dr. Devereaux states the following. An army that plans to be in the field for more than just a few days cannot bring all the food it needs with it. It must find most of its food locally. I want to look in detail at just how hard it would be to supply an army with wagons, and then take a couple of numerical examples from the medieval Domesday Book for just how an army would gather food in the field. I do highly recommend you read the logistics post linked, and here I will largely build upon the logic it sets out. So let's go back to my buddy's problem with the truck replaced by a horse. You're about to have a lot of numbers flying at you, so make sure to equip your number-deflecting bat to protect yourself. I'll put the generalized equations and data on the screen if you want to follow along, or just skip ahead to the next bit. Suppose we have a horse pulling a wagon, which eats 1 bag of grain for every mile it travels. It can carry a total of 100 such bags. We want to eventually stockpile 100 bags 100 miles away and return the horse to where we started. This way, we could eventually have a fully stocked horse 100 miles away, and then another 200 miles, and so on, eventually supplying an army however far away it needs to be. 50 miles is the farthest we could go and still come back with the horse alive. Or, if we were to go 49 miles, we could drop off 2 bags and then come back. Alternatively, we could go 1 mile out, drop off 98 bags, come back, and eventually, mile by mile, get to the destination. So the question is it better to go a short distance and drop off a lot of grain, or go far and drop off less? In the first case, of course, the whole journey would require more stops. The other thing to consider is what the ratio is between the total bags we need for this whole rigmarole versus the 100 bags we eventually deliver. Imagine we could somehow teleport bags of grain to the wagon. Then we'd need 100 bags to get to the destination 100 miles away, teleport in another 100 for the stockpile, and 1 more 100 for the journey back. So the absolute best case scenario is 3 bags at the start of the journey for every 1 bag delivered to the destination. But the way to get the actual result is to start at the end and work backwards. Say for instance that we decided to drop off 50 bags at a time. That means the distance travelled on every leg of the journey is 25 miles out and 25 miles back. As a result, to stockpile 100 bags at the destination as required, we need to stockpile 200 bags 25 miles back and make 2 trips. Applying that same logic to any other leg of the journey implies that the amount of grain doubles every time. Because each leg is 25 miles, a total of 4 legs are required to cover the whole distance. Doubling the grain 4 times, 2 to the power of 4, means a 16-fold increase. It means 1,600 bags of grain are required at the start for every 100 bags stockpiled at the destination. Remember that we're looking to see if there is an optimal amount of bags that is dropped off every time the horse stops. We can generalize what I just said to a formula which determines the grain required at the start for the 100 bags at the end, depending on the dropped off amount. Plotted on a graph, the result is clear. The way to go is to make as short trips as possible, dropping off as large an amount of grain as possible every time. The optimal solution is to go 1 mile, drop off 98 bags of grain and come back. Or even better, go just half a mile. This kind of doesn't make sense if you think about it. Making lots of little stops and then loading and unloading almost a full cart is going to be very inefficient in reality. The horse and its driver will need to eat during at least some of the loading times. So I'm going to assume that for every individual stop made, an average of 1 additional grain bag will need to be used up. Naturally, this doesn't have much effect for the small number of long trips, but it penalizes the cases with lots and lots of small trips. Looking at the curve now, there is a clear optimum when, for each leg, 86 bags are dropped off, 1 is eaten during unloading, and 13 bags are eaten by the horse to go 6.5 miles out and 6.5 miles back. Just over 1,000 bags are required at the start to stockpile 100 at the end. Taking a longer leg between stops is inefficient, like before, but shorter legs mean that a lot of grain is used during the stops. This is a better model, but the other problem is that my simple formula allows the number of stops along the journey to be a fraction. This doesn't make any sense. You either stop or you don't. This should be a whole number, so we can round up to the nearest integer. If before the formula gave the journey, let's say 6.1 legs, now, tough luck, it would have to be 7 legs. The curve now shows sharp jumps exactly where the number of stops goes up by 1. For instance, with 33 bags being dropped off, that leads to just over 3 legs required for the trip. But now, that gets rounded up to 4, and so on. The optimal solution is 89 bags dropped off, 1 eaten during the loading process, and a 5-mile distance between stops, for again, just over 1,000 bags of grain at the start to deliver 100 bags at the end. This is still a bit unrealistic, and so I think a better way to go is, instead of an analytic approach trying to derive an equation, to take an algorithmic approach. For each drop-off amount, directly calculate each of the trips made by the wagon and keep track of the total grain used. For instance, for a drop-off amount of 59 bags, the last leg would be 20 miles. There would be 2 trips over this final distance, the first one bringing a full load of 59 bags to be dropped off, and the second one only 41 bags more for the total 100, and so on. Repeated for each whole number of bags dropped off, the curve roughly follows the previous ones, but it's a lot more knobbly now, which I suppose makes it more realistic. The optimal solution here is to go 12 miles for every leg, drop off 75 bags of grain, use 1 up during the loading period, and then go 12 miles back. All except the very first leg, which only needs to be 4 miles long. The total amount of grain required is 1,344 bags, for a ratio of over 13 bags required at the start for every bag delivered. There are further tweaks to add realism to the model and optimizations to the solution, but I think you get the point. Going back to the very first simple example, the amount of grain required doubled for each 25-mile leg of the journey. This exponential growth might be dubbed the tyranny of the wagon equation, as a nod to the tyranny of the rocket equation. I've talked about this in a previous video. Suppose we had a rocket with a payload of 1 ton, where the final minute of burn required a ton of fuel. This means that the last but 1 minute of burn would require fuel for the payload and fuel to push the last ton of fuel. The total amount of fuel would double for every minute before that. The amount you need grows exponentially. This tyranny makes rocketry difficult and long-distance supply in pre-industrial societies almost impossible. Now I know what some of you will say. Actually, a horse pulling its own food in a cart can go for 200 miles or 400 miles. All the math and reasoning works if you double or quadruple all the distances appropriately. The amount of grain required still rises exponentially with distance. How can military logistics really work then? The workaround to supplying an army over a great distance is to use more advanced vehicles, such as cars, trains, ships, and planes. In the context of what I've said, these pretty much all work by having a fuel capacity much larger than the distances they are expected to travel. In reality, a car, or particularly a truck, loaded up with fuel, not just in its fuel tank but full of jerry cans in the back, that sort of thing, has a huge range compared to what it would practically need to cover. For example, Rommel's Africa Corps might have been supplied by a Mercedes-Benz L3000, so named because it could carry 3 metric tons of payload. The truck consumes between 20 and 30 litres per 100 kilometres travelled. Even taking the worst case scenario, that's a range of nearly 12,000 kilometres. Also, accounting for if the Allies had managed to hold Tobruk permanently, the road distance from Tripoli to El Alamein is only about 2,000 kilometres. Fuel for the round trip would take up about 1/3 of the cargo capacity. There is no need to break the journey into multiple legs or to have stockpiles part way, at least from a vehicle range point of view. The trucks could make it there and back, unloading only at the destination. No exponential growth in fuel consumption or wagon tyranny, except, their terrible politics. Obviously, this didn't stop the Africa Corps getting their butts rightly kicked, but the prospect of supply was at least quite realistic. Trains have an even longer range. Researching my book, I have found an example of one of the longest wartime strategic redeployments. In World War II, Pavel Kuznetsov commanded the Red Army's 26th Rifle Division as it moved by rail from near enough the Korean border in Siberia to the Eastern Front in Europe at the town of Valdai. He doesn't mention this, but almost certainly the trains carrying his division would have stopped to take on fuel and supplies deposited for them en route. The maximum range of a steam train fully loaded with coal is truly enormous, and dedicated trains would be able to make the journey from coal mines to stations along the Trans-Siberian Railway using only a fraction of their capacity. Once again, there is no exponential growth due to multiple intermediate stops, and therefore no tyranny, except all the Stalinism, etc. Ships and planes both have very large ranges relative to the circumference of the Earth, and also both have tanker variants for refueling en route. Even in pre-modern times, ships had an incredible range, with Viking longboats able to reach North America, and subsequently with Magellan able to circumnavigate the Earth. As soon as you can sail, you're no longer tyrannized because you're using the wind to move you instead of using fuel to push fuel. There is still a theoretical maximum to the range, because while you no longer need food or fuel to propel the boat, you do need food and fresh water for the crew. Coming back to medieval armies and earlier, as Dr. Devereux explains, land armies would have had to source their food by buying it from friendly locals or outright stealing it in hostile territory. The logic here is as follows. Immediately after the harvest, a peasant must have stored enough food for at least 365 days. If an army were to rob that poor person of all that food, they could feed 365 soldiers for that one day. The next day, as they marched to their objective, they would move on to another village and do the same again. Flipping that on its head, an army of 10,000 would need to shake down the equivalent of 28 adults, whether in one big village or spread out, every day to feed themselves. Halfway from one harvest to the next, when perhaps half the food has run out, the army would need to rob the equivalent to 56 adults. Of course, real villages would contain children and older people whose daily food intake is less than a soldier's, so the true number of villages would have to be higher. Consequently, the army would starve if it cannot find enough civilians to steal from, such as if they take shelter in a fortress or if the population density is too low. The larger the army, or the more time has passed since the food has been harvested, the harder it is to supply. I want to put some numbers to this issue, and for once, instead of pulling them entirely out of my behind, I want to get them from a medieval English document called the Domesday Book. This was a survey carried out in the year 1086 on the orders of William the Conqueror, who wanted to price up the kingdom he just took over. Everything in the countryside which could be taxed, people, pastures, ploughs, fisheries and so on, was recorded and valued. It was named Doomsday, as in the Day of Judgment. Everyone in the country had been appraised. Except that is, some of the cities, like London, have been left out. I suspect in part because the king was more interested in lands held by the rural, feudal aristocracy answerable to him, not the cities which had more independent rights. The Domesday has since been painstakingly digitized, with places matched to the modern-day British Ordnance Survey grid, allowing their locations to be displayed thus. The modern-day city of Coventry, which now has a population of 1/3 had 69 people recorded in Domesday, worth £12 per year to its overlord. Back in 1066, the aristocrat collecting taxes was the local countess, someone you may have heard of, a certain Lady Godiva, whose visage is still associated with taxation in the locality. The village of Hemmingstone was similarly sized at 65 people, with some land there later granted to Roland the Farter. His holdings never really took off, however, and Hemmingstone remains a village to this day. The Domesday Book lists people by their broad social class, but it only effectively counts the head of each household. In reality, every villager would have a family, children, maybe siblings or older relatives. On the other hand, each slave recorded in the book probably does just represent one person, and for priests that may be somewhere in between. As a simplification, I'm going to assume a flat number of 4 real humans for every person mentioned in the book, regardless of profession. With that in mind, let's look at the overall population density of England in 1086, sampled over 5 by 5 kilometre squares. The agricultural south and east of the country is densely populated. There are gaps in data around London, as I mentioned. The northwest is rugged, quite beautiful in fact, but to this day only sparsely settled. The fens were marshland in this time and likewise underpopulated. The rest of the country looks like the population is fairly evenly spread, working the land. This is deceptive. The digitized dataset gives grid locations accurate to the nearest kilometre. Looking at the population within each 1 by 1 kilometre square, it is much more granular. The people are tightly clumped into settlements, with most of the territory in between being farms or forests, but not settled directly. In some cases it is clear that the villages are clumped along roads, such as around Salisbury. I'm going to use this data to model how an army of 10,000 soldiers might be supplied. Let's assume that the army is hostile and must therefore forage food by force. To start with, I'm going to look at moving the army from Oxford to Cambridge. To those who are aware of the rivalry between England's 2 oldest universities, it should be clear why an army might do this. I'm essentially picturing a 10,000-man Bullingdon club marauding its way through the countryside. To simulate the army's scheme of manoeuvre, I've used an algorithm to invent a set of roads throughout the country. I'm assuming that each village is connected to some of its neighbours by near enough straight roads, making a patchwork network which I think is quite realistic for that sort of society. Given all this, today we would use a variant of Dijkstra's algorithm to obtain mathematically the most optimal route from point to point, but this is clearly beyond the capabilities of a medieval army. I'm therefore going to assume a more heuristic approach. At each village, I will have them choose to take whichever path points most closely in the direction of the destination. So in this case, if at some point Cambridge is directly to the northeast, they'll choose the most northeasterly road at that time. I think this is as close to optimum as could be expected at that time, assuming that the army does not get lost or sidetracked. My imagining army keeps a steady pace of exactly 12.5 kilometers per day. Following the roads, if they end up partway between 2 villages after a day's march, I'm assuming they camp immediately in the field. The total route is 122 kilometers long, to be covered in 10 days. As I mentioned previously, in the absolute best case scenario, the equivalent to 28 adults would have enough food stored up to feed our army of 10,000 for a day. That's fine, because they encounter on average 350 people in the villages along their route every day. Remember though that I'm multiplying Domesday Book numbers by 4. In reality, the real requirement would rise very quickly. After harvest time, stocks of food would begin to be eaten. Food would be hidden by the villagers themselves, stockpiled in fortifications, or deliberately destroyed by the organized defenders as a scorched earth policy. This isn't to mention that the army itself would have steeper food requirements. They would need to feed the horses of their cavalry contingent, draft animals pulling things like arrows, spare weapons, tools to make field repairs, and so on. There is enough population along the route to allow for a factor of 10 increase over the best case scenario, but a factor of 20 would be devastating. The army could greatly increase their capability to forage by sending out small raiding parties in all directions. I'm going to assume they're able to attack any village 10 kilometers out from the path of the army and make it to camp for the night. Any further and they would struggle to catch up, be liable to ambush, and have trouble with command and control in an era before radios or even paper messages. I'm taking this distance to be as the crow flies, not necessarily along paths. This creates a sort of worm shape of devastation through the countryside. There are now thousands of poor civilians within reach. The number is higher on the first and last days because I've allowed the raiders to operate behind Oxford and ahead of Cambridge. Even on the intervening days, a daily average of nearly 3,200 are in range of the foraging raiders. This should be more than enough to supply the army. Another consideration is that the army would likely find foodstuffs like wheat in grain form and would want to grind it into flour and bake it into bread. The Domesday Book mentions many mills throughout England where this could be done. The army doesn't always pass by one on its daily march, but there are many of them within 10 kilometres, more than 30 on some of the days. In the agricultural heart of medieval England, an army could supply itself on the move. This route is also in line with the original problem of resupplying the army by horse and cart from an original start point. Provided the distances are not great, the carts could stop and use some of these villages as rest points or stockpiles. A longer and more interesting route for our army is from Winchester in the south, almost due north to what was then the village of Thirsk in Yorkshire. The trip of almost 400 kilometres would take the army 32 days to cover. The first half of the journey is similar to before. There are some gaps in the Domesday coverage near Winchester, but overall we are still getting a few hundred people living directly along the army's daily route, and certainly thousands within range of the raiding parties. Tens of mills are in range daily in the south. Northwards from the middle of the country, the population density thins out. This was an area which revolted and was intentionally devastated by William the Conqueror. On day 20 of the journey, the army itself encounters only 80 people, while the number in range of the foragers falls below 1,000 for the first time. Only a handful of mills are in range from then on. Day 31 is particularly difficult, with the food supply of only a couple of hundred people total available for the army to get at. This would almost certainly be insufficient for that day. If the army wanted to stop for a battle or a siege, or return the way it had come, it would be in real logistical trouble. If we consider that England in the High Middle Ages was quite stable and reasonably densely populated, it just shows the challenges armies faced in the rest of Europe and beyond. Looking at this has really made me think about how hard it is to supply an army, how devastating armies throughout history would be to civilians, and why you would want to build a network of castles or forts to protect the population with the militarily important stocks of food they had. Thank you for watching.